And welcome to this ESF session today, which is essentially part of our learning network, the work that we're doing on our Well Beyond program. And my name's Susan McKenzie and I'm CEO at the Emergency Services Foundation and also chair of the Emergency Services Foundation's Learning Network. So for those of you who don't know what that is, that brings together wellbeing managers from right across the sector. Some of them are online today. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And for me, that's the Bunurong land down on the Mornington Peninsula. And what a beautiful place that is today. I can have to say I feel very fortunate. So the purpose of today is for Kristen Barton from Right Management to share with us the findings of the work that they have done in relation to speaking to people who have retired from the emergency services. So just to put this into context for everyone, we are doing some work in relation to helping people retire well from their lifetime in the emergency services. And we're doing several pieces of work. Sarah's just completed a very big literature review. So she's looking at what the issues are and what people all around the world are doing in this space. Then we've had Kristen do this piece of work. Kristen and the people at Right Management do this piece of work on actually speaking to people who have retired, because obviously we want their lived experience in developing what we are doing going forward. And going forward, I'll talk to you a little bit more about that at the end of what we're doing. So how do we get onto Right Management to do this work is because in Australia, it's really the Defence Force that's doing a lot in this space. And when I spoke to the people at the Defence Force, they were very good in sharing information with me, but they also introduced me to the people at Right Management. And that's how we met Kristen and her colleagues and why we decided to ask them to do this piece of qualitative research for us. And as far as we know, this work hasn't been done anywhere else in Australia, with people actually speaking to those who have left the emergency services. So how we'll do this is Kristen will give a presentation and then there'll be opportunity for a bit of a discussion at the end. But as I said, I'm recording this so it can be shared elsewhere later. So I'm going to hand over to you, Kristen.
Great, thanks Susan, and I'm just going to get this slide deck loaded and make sure that everyone can see that okay.
It's good, all good.
Everyone seeing that? Sorry. Great, so yeah, thanks Susan for that introduction and welcome everyone to this session. I thought we might have lost a few people now that the Ring of Steel is down and some borders are open, and I know a number of people that we spoke to talked about how they hadn't been able to enjoy their retirement as much as they would have liked to over the last couple of years. So I suspect a few of those might be on the road missing in action. But thank you to those of you that have been able to join, and I can see certainly some familiar names and faces of some of the people that we spoke to, which is great to see you, and some new faces too. So welcome everybody. As Susan said, I'm from Right Management. I'm a senior consultant there, and Right Management has been working in the space of career transition, including transition to retirement for the last 38 years in Australia. And we're also the contracted Commonwealth provider of career transition support services for members of the Australian Defence Force, including transition to retirement. And that's how, as Susan said, that's how the conversation started with Susan and how we ended up getting involved in this work, which I must say has been a real pleasure to be involved in, and it was really the highlight of my day to be speaking to people who I did speak to over the last couple of months, who shared their stories with us about their transition to retirement experiences, and there were some absolutely fascinating stories and journeys in there. So I really do thank each and every one of the 31 people that we spoke to for giving that time to us, for so candidly sharing your experiences, both the ups and downs of the journey, and I hope you see some of those key themes that we talked about captured in our presentation today. Clearly, we're not going to capture every theme that every person talked about, but we certainly have tried to capture the themes that we commonly heard about and then make some recommendations that really incorporate some of the ideas you shared with us as well. All right, so what I'll be taking you through today is telling you a little bit more about the study. One of the things we explored was people's feelings leading up to retirement. So we'll share what people talked about there. The positive retirement transitions, and there were many people that were flourishing and thriving really in retirement, even though that initial transition might have been a bit challenging in ways. We'll talk about what we heard about the contributing factors towards that thriving in retirement. We'll also talk about some of the key challenges that we heard about in that transition. We asked people about their key learnings and also about what advice they would have for others who were about to transition to retirement. So we'll share what people said in that regard. We also asked people about how organisations can better support transition to retirement and the ideas people had there. So we'll share those thoughts. We asked people about what they thought the most valuable type of support looked like, and again we'll talk about that, and then bringing that together in our recommendations, which both incorporated people's feedback and stories and experiences, but also externally, what we know from the work we do about what works well in terms of helping people to transition successfully to retirement, whether we're talking about other related fields or the Australian general market more broadly. All right, so I just want to make sure I've got the chat. I'm trying to get the chat up in front of me so that if anyone does have any questions or comments, I certainly encourage participation. So if you want to make a comment or ask a question in the chat function as we go, and maybe Susan and Sarah can keep an eye on that too in case I miss any comments or questions there, because I'm happy to take questions as we go, and then we'll also have time for questions at the end. So just some information there about the study and the study participants. So we were aiming for 30 and we were desperate to get to our magic number of 30, and we ended up interviewing 30 people. And those people were recruited through the Emergency Services Foundation network. So one of the things we were aware of early in the piece was that it was not actually very easy to access people to participate in this study because either the agencies didn't retain contact details for people or were constrained in sharing those contact details because of privacy concerns. So it actually made it a bit more difficult to recruit people to participate, and that's called a snowball sampling method, where we grow the sample of people that we're asking to participate through a network, and that's what we needed to do in this case to make sure that we're able to recruit sufficient people. So most of the people we spoke to had retired through age, although some had retired from service due to medical retirement or to resignation. And the age of retirement was really quite varied, as you can see on the slide there. And we had a nice mix of people from various agencies. So we had 10 retired police, 9 retired ambulance or paramedics, and 12 retired firefighters from various organisations, and 1 person previously with the SES. Gender balance is always a goal. However, obviously the composition of the emergency services has got a particular skew towards males, and we found that too with the population, but we did have some females participate too, which was great. All right, one of the things we asked about was people's feelings about retirement leading up to the date. And as you can imagine, there were various responses here from a diverse group of people. So for some, they talked of enthusiasm and really looking forward to transitioning to retirement. For some, they talked about, it was my time, they were ready to go based on age or based on this kind of magic number that a number of people referred to of having had 30 years service. So their superannuation arrangements were maximised. And I guess that was something interesting to us too, because with 30 years service, we're potentially talking about people who are around 50 and still may have many years of working life ahead of them. And we did find that, as I'll talk about later, in terms of the high proportion of people from this group who were officially retired from the emergency services work, but were had moved on to either doing paid or volunteer work in a range of different areas. But many people talked about looking forward to the next phase and the next challenge, particularly where they had a plan in place about what they wanted to do next in that next phase, and they were in good health. Many people talked about having mixed feelings. Some said that they hadn't been enjoying their role as much lately, and that was part of the reason that they were, keen to transition. But they were also aware of what they'd be giving up, and were concerned about how that next phase might be, given the uncertainty that they had. When I said some talked about not having enjoyed their roles more recently, some talked about organisational change, politics, not being as aligned to the new strategic direction of the agency that they've retired out of. And then there were a proportion of people who, I guess the best word was, probably felt a sense of rejection and disappointment. Some people felt they'd been pushed out, particularly if they had had injuries or had been mentally unwell leading up to their retirement. And those were the people who found that experience leading up to retirement and the transition to retirement itself more challenging, as you would expect. All right, when we spoke to people about better understanding the really positive retirement transitions and what was common to people who were really thriving in their retirement, we found 4 key factors that were really coming through consistently there from people. One of those was having a plan. So that was a very common theme, and those people who had transitioned well typically had a plan. That didn't just mean having their finances under control, although that was very important to people, but it also meant they had a plan about what they were going to be spending their time on and what was going to give them that sense of purpose and meaning moving forward. And that second one, and so what we've tried to present these in order of how frequently these came up. Purpose was really a common theme too, that those people who had transitioned well and were thriving continued to have a sense of purpose. So it might have been that they continued on the purpose that they had through their work, but they tended to have a number of other things going on in life and a sense of purpose beyond their emergency services work too. So they might have had real passions, interests, a broad range of hobbies, and so many of them already had those things in place and were just looking forward to the opportunity to spend more time on those other activities that gave them a great sense of purpose in life as well. Support and connections, as you would expect, very important. People talked primarily about the support of their own partner, if they had a partner and they were in a relationship, and how important spouses and partners were as the number one support person in that transition. But that support and connection being a broader concept there around feeling supported by their employer, being connected to their workmates still, but also their social connections, community and broader family was very important. And health and wellbeing, as you would expect, critically important too. So those people who had positive transitions were more likely to have been in good physical and mental health. All right, when we talk about the key challenges that we heard about from people, again, we've tried to present these themes in order of the frequency with which people talked about them. And the number one thing we heard about was that loss of sense of community and camaraderie. Almost everybody spoke about that was the key thing they missed, the key thing that they found the most difficult. They missed their workmates, and they missed that sense of camaraderie, that sitting around or being on a common mission, if you like, with those people. Identity impact was a theme that we were keen to explore, and many people did refer to themselves as a retired emergency services worker, whether it be retired police officer, retired firefighter, retired paramedic. Some people specifically said that this wasn't as big a deal for them, and those people were more likely to have other things going on in life that also impacted their sense of identity. But many people, felt the impact greatly. All right, the next one on the list there was that some people felt disappointed by the way the fact that some people really felt that they'd had a disappointing exit and that they'd been surprised and disappointed by the lack of contact after they left. So they thought they would have heard more from people. So, you know, people appreciating, yes, life goes on. However, I haven't heard from anyone, or I've hardly heard from anyone. And I'm actually surprised about that. The transition to retirement had a negative impact on their mental health, but most people that talked about the mental health challenges that they had experienced were more relating that challenge back to the work itself, and that being a work-related injury, trauma or PTSD, with challenges continuing into their retirement. Mental health outcomes were better for those who were physically and mentally well pre-transition and had a clear purpose and plan, had support in place, and in regards to partner, family, friends, etc. Some people stated that they were disappointed about not receiving their service awards or adequate recognition of their contribution and service. So some people talked about when at the point of retirement, that perhaps a note went out, an email went out about their retirement, but it was very short and sweet and didn't really acknowledge their individual contribution or them as a person. So I think some people certainly felt disappointed by that. And a number of people spoke about, whoops, just skip forward there. A number of people spoke about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which almost feels like we're getting to the that being old news now, but it certainly has been a really big theme and big impact on people's lives, obviously, over the last couple of years.
Kristen, did you see any difference? Or I know it's a very small sample and we weren't comparing agencies necessarily, but was there any one particular group that sort of stood out? Somebody's asked here, obviously from police, whether they were more disgruntled.
No, I wouldn't say there was one group jumping out as being the most disgruntled. I think each of those bigger groups had some people who had a pretty good transition and some who were disgruntled, if you like. So there was it wasn't really jumping out that, gee, what's going on in that particular agency. There just seemed to be a kind of a fairly even spread between the three key groups that we had, if you like, about some people that had a tough time and some people that hadn't. But thanks for the question. Yeah. We're just talking about that COVID impact, and, you know, obviously it's impacted the quality of retirement experience for people so far, for those who've retired over the last couple of years, but also impacted the actual transition to retirement experience, where many of the things that normally would have happened didn't happen. So, you know, for some people, they weren't able to have that kind of rites of passage retirement celebration, whether it be a big deal or whether it be going to the pub with your mates, but things like that weren't able to happen because of all of the constraints that we've had in Victoria. And some people talked about having to work from home, so again, it's all a bit of a blur, isn't it, over the last couple of years, but in early days, some people were mandated to work from home because of their age. So their colleagues were still working in a normal way, but the older people were mandated to work from home around that time, where there was concern that there was greater COVID exposure and health risk to people who were older. So those people felt a bit singled out, and some of the people we spoke to, you know, didn't enjoy that experience of working from home, felt isolated, and perhaps that meant that their experience of that final stage of their working life wasn't as enjoyable as they were hoping it had been. Okay, and here's some quotes from people, and for those study participants on the call, you might see some of your own words here, but I'll give you a moment to read through these quotes from people about that transition to retirement experience. So hopefully that brings it to life a little bit. And when I said earlier about people sitting around, that was the sitting around comment at the end, not trying to make a comment to say that people are typically sitting around not doing much in their jobs. But that one's about sitting around the mess table. I had a particular vision in my mind about people in that one that really stuck. Okay. Here's some other themes that came through about that transition experience. So some people talked about reluctance to seek support. So they were saying, look, I was all right. You know, I had a pretty good transition. I didn't really need much support. And for most people, they access support from ESSS Super, but they didn't access other services. But even those people who said, look, I didn't need support, almost everybody knew of other people who hadn't transitioned well to retirement, even if they had themselves. So most people acknowledged the need for improved support to make sure that their mates were looked after, even if they felt like they'd had a pretty good run themselves. The second point there was a number of people spoke about that lack of debrief opportunity, or that kind of exit or transition to retirement interview opportunity. And actually we had feedback from a few people who we interviewed saying, gee, it's actually been a really useful and enjoyable conversation today, and I wish that I'd had a conversation like this when I finished up in the organisation. So that was probably a bit of a surprise to us, that those exit or transition to retirement interviews weren't happening. Just to hear people's perspectives on the way out. We know they're really important in this space and more broadly as well. Another theme that came through was people talking positively about their superannuation and the ESSS Super being highly regarded, but there was a lack of other support. So certainly the superannuation support was what was valued and accessed, but people commented that was the main thing, and there really weren't that many other types of support that they were aware of or that they accessed. There was another theme coming through that a number of people spoke about, saying, hey, you know, emergency services is not necessarily a job for life anymore. And when we think about services and support moving forward, we need to take account of that. So in particular, a number of people who had retired from paramedic roles spoke about that in particular. And I know that theme of potential shorter service is not necessarily across the board, but there are a number of people that referred to it that were paramedics and said, because we're currently seeing people stay in the paramedic role for a shorter period of time, we need to really focus on career planning throughout the career, rather than just assuming that people will be there until they have an age-based retirement. Another theme that came through was people really valuing hearing from others who were also from emergency services. So valuing hearing from those people, valuing staying in touch from those people, and also valuing support from those people. And we know that a number of people we spoke to specifically were volunteers in the peer support network space, and they may have accessed that support themselves and were also contributing back to the community through providing that support through many of the retired service organisations. Another theme that we heard about was that many said that conversation in the workplace about approaching retirement was really awkward, and that they kind of weren't comfortable necessarily raising it. They were concerned about the way that would be viewed. They were concerned about that that it would be viewed that they weren't committed if they were thinking about transitioning to retirement, and they were concerned about being sidelined or pushed out. And so some people also said if managers or leaders raised it with them, that worried them as well. So there just seemed to be not a clear approach to the way this is handled, and it seemed to be a challenge for individuals and probably a challenge for managers and leaders as well in how to manage that sensitively. I've already talked about the high level of satisfaction with superannuation arrangements, but another thing we heard about was when we were asking people about, you know, how they worked up to retirement, the predominant model was for people to have worked full-time up to retirement. And that's a bit different to what we see in other sectors, where certainly contemporary practice for organisations is to try and provide some flexibility for people in transitioning to retirement more gradually, rather than kind of, you know, running 100 miles an hour to the finish line and then stopping. So what we heard from a number of people was that the current superannuation rules through ESSS Super actually have an impact on that and constrain people's ability to gradually transition to retirement, because the amount that people receive is calculated over the last couple of years or so. So that minimises their willingness to reduce hours or, shift work, etc., move to part-time work, even though it would have been preferable for them to do so otherwise. So that was an interesting one that we heard about. All right. Another thing we were surprised about was just the proportion of people in the study who were either doing paid work or volunteering after their transition to retirement from emergency services. So it was actually 85% of people in the study either said that they were actively involved in some paid or volunteer work or intended to do so. So some of them were very recent retirees, a couple of them were about to retire. But as you can see from that number, the vast majority of them were doing some kind of volunteering or paid work. And that's a higher percentage than we would typically see in the broader community. And I think that's partially explained by the way in which we recruited people through the network, because we recruited them through the network and many of them through the retired emergency services associations, that then we're likely to get people who are more actively engaged in volunteering, for example. But we heard some really fascinating stories about the types of work that people were doing, volunteered and paid work, beyond their transition to retirement. So I'll just give you some examples of that. So the emergency services related paid work included consulting in emergency management, non-emergency patient transport, teaching paramedicine at university, setting up a business in training medical staff in basic life support, owning a business in traffic management, undertaking roadside fire protection work for a local council are some examples. In regards to the non-emergency services related paid work, again, really varied here, including property development, being a funeral director, working in real estate sales, owning a pub, advisory work and board and committee members for those who had been more senior within emergency services. Then the emergency service related volunteer work, what we found was interesting is that none of the people we spoke to were volunteering in the same organisation that they had worked in. So many of them were volunteering in peer support roles through, either the retired police, ambulance or foresters associations, but they weren't volunteering in a formal sense back directly with the organisation that they had retired from. And the non-emergency services related volunteer work included things like driving a school bus for school excursions and school camps. Many people were in leadership roles in community groups such as Lions, surf lifesaving clubs, golf clubs, men's sheds, etc. So just some really fascinating stories there about the way that and the proportion of people that were really actively contributing to community, society beyond their transition to retirement. And many of those people were people in their 60s, 70s, etc., as well as some that were younger. Okay. We asked people about their key learnings and the advice they have for others who are transitioning to retirement. Here are some of the quotes of what people said. So again, you can see, a real variety of themes there, but the having a plan, you need to have a plan, was the most common piece of advice that people gave. And as I said before, that plan wasn't just about the financial side of things. It was about what are you going to do? How are you going to structure your week? What's going to give you a sense of enjoyment and purpose to really be able to thrive in the next phase of life? Okay, we asked people about their views of how organisations, agencies can better support those transitioning to retirement. And here's the top 10, if you like, themes that came through those conversations. And look, in some cases, these things are already being provided, but people were just reiterating how important they were. In some cases, they were talking about doing better in this space. So clearly, the superannuation, financial literacy and financial planning piece is critical. The most common support that people accessed was that superannuation support. Many people, well, a number of people had invested in further financial planning. They tended to be the people who had retired at the more senior end of roles within emergency services and probably had, more capacity to pay for those services, because people were talking about, investing $5,000 plus in paying for professional financial planning, etc. But I guess one of the other themes I would mention is that, as I said before, people tended to be positive about their superannuation arrangements, and in general, people tended to be in a better financial position in terms of their own explanation of that. We didn't hear as much financial stress coming through as we might with other populations of people. And obviously that financial wellbeing is tied to length of service. Those people who had less financial security tended to be people who may have left emergency services earlier than they had initially planned to, or people who might have experienced a marriage, breakdown or divorce and had to split assets, etc. were not as well positioned. But in general, the population was pretty well positioned, and that financial stress wasn't a key theme coming through about transition to retirement. Mental health support is clearly critical, and we know, given especially the incidence of mental health concerns and PTSD, etc., within emergency services workers, and that certainly came through as a key theme from many people. People either said they valued this support themselves, or they, even if they didn't feel that they needed it themselves, they really felt it was very important to other people. And that included things like having ongoing access to counselling beyond service, but also having a proper mental health, a formal assessment or debrief completed, and having a mental health plan in place upon transition to retirement. A number of people we spoke to had experienced injuries at work and had ongoing physical health challenges and injury-based challenges where they needed that ongoing support. And again, that was flagged as being very important to have ongoing support there. The other thing I should mention too is people talked about the importance of their family members also having access to some of these services, such as counselling beyond retirement, as they may have when people are in service, in being able to access things like an employee assistance program. Another key theme coming through was just people talking about agencies should better utilise people's expertise and experience, even though they've retired. So there are lots of opportunities that expertise and experience could be utilised better, whether that be in providing peer support or mentoring, or some people talked about, being able to do casual work. So raising the question about, well, why couldn't, the appropriately screened person who has retired from full-time service, why couldn't they provide backup support? Surely that would be helpful from a workforce planning and management point of view. For example, in police, doing unsworn work or doing the work that wasn't, that was more security, etc. So I guess wishing that there was more opportunity to get involved in that way for the right people was a theme that was coming through. I talked before about that recognition of service and contribution, and just it's not a huge effort to, I guess, more carefully consider the way those messages are crafted. For example, a retirement message, if there's a message going out, can we just put a little bit more thought into that recognition of the individual and their own contributions, of that person's feeling really good about feeling viewed on the way out. So some small things there that can make a really big difference to people, because if they're not managed well, people talked about, you know, really a bad taste being left in their mouth on the way out, and really a missed opportunity to recognise them, and, you know, that potentially having not just a positive impact for them, but a positive impact on the people that they're leaving behind as well. Debrief and exit interview, people said that was really important. It certainly didn't sound like it was happening across the board. Some people sounded like they'd had the opportunity to do that, but others said that should have been in place and it wasn't. Many people were looking for avenues to stay in touch, and, you know, whether it be alumni events, and it seemed like a lot of that was happening more informally rather than formally, and through other organisations that focused on supporting people post-retirement rather than the agencies themselves. But there was certainly an opportunity for more to be done in that space. I mentioned before that feedback from people about check-ins from ex-managers and colleagues, and just being really surprised that I haven't heard from anybody. And I kind of would have expected that. And it wasn't a particular pocket of people that said that. It was kind of across the board. And even those people who had been very senior and transitioned to retirement from very senior roles, they said the same thing. They were surprised they hadn't heard from people, and they hadn't heard from leadership within their former organisation. There was a theme around, yes, that the help with the superannuation side was good, but it would have been good to get help more broadly. And in particular, because so many people were looking at transitioning to other work or to volunteering, making sure that they had support to help them with that. So a number of people said that would have been helpful to get me ready for that market and get me ready to be more prepared in thinking about what next. Because many people struggled with that. Well, what even could I do next? Where are my skills transferable? What do I want to do next? And how do I go about finding that work? And I think especially the people who had transitioned medically sounded like they'd had a real period where that was a real struggle with them, and they felt very lost and didn't know what they wanted to do next, and could really have benefited from some formal support in that regard. Many people that we spoke to ended up getting their next role or their next volunteering opportunity through their network. Through their emergency services network or their mates outside of work. Here's some quotes about what people said about how organisations or agencies can better support people in the transition to retirement. And again, I think a lot of them support what I've already talked about in some of those key themes there coming through. All right, just moving on to what we recommended as a result of what we heard. So the way we've presented this is to first present the theme that we heard commonly coming through, and then talk about the recommendations of what we thought could be done to address that particular theme. So that first theme there was about people feeling cut off and disappointed with lack of contact post-retirement. So an obvious one there is to have a structured alumni program where people can be communicated with, to stay in touch with what's going on, but also potentially having events where people can get together. And look, that's not going to be for everybody. Certainly some people who, you know, we might say were more in that disgruntled group, you know, who had a more difficult time. You know, some people really did want their space. Some people certainly said they had a period of time where they didn't want to have contact. So it's not across the board that everyone was super engaged and wanting to stay in touch. But I think it's something that people could opt into there at the point of transition, about whether they would like to stay in touch and participate in things like an alumni program, and opportunities to utilise their expertise and experience as well, whether that be peer support, mentoring, providing advice, being asked to participate in events such as transition to retirement events where they might be presenting about their experience and sharing their learnings, etc. So certainly lots of opportunities for that. And a really simple one that could be done is around just having once someone is transitioning to retirement, having clear accountability for a leader within the organisation, a leader who had a good relationship with that person, to diarise a couple of check-ins with that person, a simple phone call a couple of times in that first year of transition would make a big difference. And even if there wasn't a lengthy conversation, just to know that someone had cared, had followed up, had wanted to check in on how someone was doing is a really easy, simple one that could make a big difference in how people feel. Another theme was that reluctance for some to seek support, and we felt that, you know, involving retired emergency services workers in presentations and seminars for those who are approaching transition to retirement could really help in the uptake, especially if people are able to talk from personal experience about how those things may have assisted them. Another theme was about not feeling adequately recognised or thanked. So, you know, typically people said there had been an announcement of some kind that had gone out about their retirement, but it seemed that a little bit more effort could have been put into more personalised communication that had more recognition of service and that particular individual's contributions. Those rites of passage celebration events are obviously really important for people, and you know, important that they are organised. It seems that in some cases these have kind of been deferred, postponed or shelved in the last couple of years given the constraints of COVID. So it would be great if they could be revisited rather than just let them slide if, you know, really important for people to pick that opportunity up and, hey, they've suddenly lifted restrictions and we can get together again, and really great for those to be revisited rather than let go because they are really important to people. Another key theme coming through was just the lack of options for people in gradually transitioning. And as I said, we were hearing that was mainly because of the constraints around superannuation rules about the way that was calculated. But clearly this is an important one to address, because that having availability of flexible work options and gradual transition to retirement is really going to help people in making a more gradual transition rather than a sudden, as I said before, going 100% and then stopping 100%. So, you know, when we think externally about the way this is managed in other sectors, that's a key part of that transition to retirement reality these days. And it seems that there's certainly the opportunity to move towards that, but those constraints would obviously need to be addressed, assuming they still exist. The lack of debrief exit interview one is there too, and we've recommended that there are mandatory structured exit interviews and debriefs, as well as that psychological assessment or debrief to be done by a mental health professional, so that people can have mental health plans in place upon their transition to retirement. As we mentioned before, there was a key theme coming through that superannuation support was accessed, but there was a lack of other retirement planning support. And certainly there's an opportunity for there to be a suite or range of services offered to people that would ideally be a combination of online resources as well as the in-person support. It might be group sessions and one-on-one support, and that could include both peer support from other retired emergency services workers, but also professional transition to retirement support that might include things like you know, helping people think through what they're going to most enjoy, what they're best suited to, transferable skills, and positioning themselves for other opportunities to do relevant paid and volunteer work. Those who medically retired found the transition to retirement most difficult and needed most support, and many of those people really struggled with, although they eventually might have gone on to do some volunteer or paid work, there certainly was a period of time for many where they were really struggling after their initial retirement. So we've recommended that particular group especially would benefit from that professional career planning and career transition support to help prepare for that transition. Similarly, most that retired for services went on to some paid and volunteer work, and as we heard, emergency services work isn't necessarily a job for life now, which both those themes reinforce the need for that professional career planning and career transition support. All right.
Okay, I might take over from here, Kristen.
Please do, Susan.
So thank you very much for that. Now, has anybody got any questions for Kristen, please, about what you've heard? And you know, maybe could I start with you, Lex, for example? You were one of the people that were interviewed as part of this process and program. Does that sound like a sort of a fair and reasonable sort of presentation of some of the things that you, or the themes that you might have raised?
Absolutely. I've got to say, when the interview was on with Kristen, very quickly she found my sense of humour, and that showed up in the interview, because if you feel like your brains are being picked, you'll sit back a bit. But if you feel like you're contributing, and I did feel like I was contributing, there was an interesting one there about the lack of empathy by senior management.
Excuse me, Lex, just one moment. Can we stop sharing the screen, please?
Oh, sorry, Susan. Yep.
Sorry, go on, Lex.
Yeah. Oh, there we are. What a fine-looking bunch of people too. Good, great moustache, Steve. The lack of empathy across all the agencies was interesting. I'm still doing peer support, which I started doing prior to the Black Saturday bushfires. Sort of herded into that. Most Wednesdays I sit with a group of retired police officers and have lunch, and that's a peer support job. And we talk about the issues that we see within society at the moment. A lot of the problems that we've got coming out of senior management are being mirrored in our current society, and certainly COVID's not helping that. Middle management, I find, understanding of it and supportive of people. I didn't have a very good exit interview because COVID sort of wandered in and squashed it.
So let's just tell people, which agency did you retire from?
I was Parks Victoria, and started out life in the old Forest Commission of Victoria as a young bloke, and did a few other jobs, but then came back to the industry, which I loved, and my main area in there was bushfires.
Okay, all right. Well, that's good. Thank you for sharing that. Other people, what did you think? Wayne Bishop, and you've done loads of work in this area. To me, that sounds very similar to things that we've spoken about over the years, Wayne.
Most certainly, Susan. I think the thing is I found very interesting there, and thank you very much, Kristen, that was fabulous. The thing that I found very interesting is that it wasn't just some of the issues there that were raised are not exclusive to the emergency services area. And I think it's something that it shows that how organisations, period, can do a better job in preparing people. I think it also reinforced the point, the importance of starting early from both the organisation's point of view and also the individual's point of view. And that I think that the fact that you reinforced that, and that the people that you interviewed reinforced that, is a really important factor. One question I had was that did the participants show an interest themselves in mentoring?
Many of them, Wayne, were already doing some peer support.
Yes.
Look, a number of people did talk about they would be open to mentoring, and some people, I think, when we said no one formally volunteered back with their previous agency, a number of people informally did, though, in that they provided support, guidance, mentoring to previous colleagues and team members, whether, about a range of issues. So I think informally people were doing mentoring, but not formally, other than the peer support through those retired associations.
Yes.
And I think what's interesting about this study is, well, first of all, it was like, pulling teeth trying to get participants. We know this is a huge problem because agencies don't keep in touch with people. You know, people leave the service. Some people get very skeptical about being involved in things, and, you know, they're suspicious of what it's all about and so forth. So obviously, you know, there was some skewing in this in terms of how we recruited people. But the other thing I find fascinating in this is that you mentioned a couple of times that people said, you know, I didn't need support, but maybe my mates did. That absolutely replicates the Beyond Blue study when we're talking about mental health. And really what that says in relation to stigma is, I'm okay, but, you know, my mate over there, he needs help, but don't worry about me, I'm fine. And it was very, very similar to that, which I found quite fascinating. So in terms of the need for mentoring, I think if we had a much larger sample of people, it would that would come out a lot more, Wayne. But I suspect that they're not the people who spoke to us.
Susan, I'm not sure if you can see, but Steve Mulligan's got his hand up.
Oh, yes, Steve, please.
Yeah, the mentoring issue and the getting back and connecting with the current day workforce has been raised with Ambulance Victoria following a recent couple of suicides amongst ambulance personnel, where speaking to people such as Code 9 PTSD and the ambulance input into that, I sat down with, had a video thing with the CEO of Ambulance Victoria, Tony Walker, and we actually discussed this. And how do we get together? How do we connect with the current day workforce? Right? And it's not an easy topic, especially under COVID, and especially under the vaccination rules at the moment. It makes it very difficult for people to get together. But it has been raised and has been discussed. Certainly in AV, the retired community are active in both maintaining relationships with their internal networks and with AV. So it has been raised, it has been discussed, but it's not an easy thing to do under the current workloads of emergency services.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I'm going to come back and tell you how we're going to use this. I'm very conscious of the time. There's one question there from Margaret, who's saying, did those in the study indicate a preference for volunteering inside emergency management, or were they more likely to say they wanted to leave the sector?
Yeah, it wasn't a question that we specifically asked them, Margaret, and as you can see, they were really diverse experiences of where people were volunteering. So I didn't hear from anyone saying they wish they had been able to volunteer for their previous organisation. We were just commenting on where they did end up, but we didn't explore that particular issue in much depth, other than when we got to the end to go, gee, it's interesting that no one was actually volunteering formally back with their own, but they were certainly volunteering in many cases, supporting their people who'd come from, in those roles, but not being employed as a volunteer or directly through that organisation.
I just want to bring this to a conclusion now, because I know people need to go to meetings and so forth. So where we're at with this is one piece of work that's contributing to the Emergency Services Foundation's what we're calling a Well Beyond program. So the Emergency Services Foundation obviously is taking a sector-wide view, because, this sort of work, it makes more sense for the foundation to do this with a sector lens on it than each individual agency going off and doing their own individual research when they're resource poor and they're all under pressure at the moment. So what we're looking at doing is applying this to a couple of things. One is what I'm calling a systems framework. And basically what that is a guideline for all of the agencies to say, as we go across the career span, these are the things that we need to be doing for individuals that are employed, their family, their leader, and what the organisation can be doing at these different points in a person's career. So when they're recruited right through to when they're retiring and post-retiring. And that's being pulled together at the moment. And this work is really informing that, as is Sarah's literature review. The other thing that we're looking at doing is setting up a program whereby we have retired people from the emergency services working with people who are yet to retire to help them plan. Because all of the work that we do, everywhere we go, we know that people say they want to be spoken to by somebody just like them with their same experience. And we're working with Swinburne to help us develop that program and to evaluate that program. And we believe that this work that we're doing is really unique and not being done anywhere else in terms, there are peer programs, of course. There's the Victorian Retired Police Veterans, there's the Ambulance Victoria Retired Association, but no formalised coaching program like what we have in mind. And we are going to be working with those organisations to bring them into this program. So this work is going to be really well applied now to the sector over the next year, I suppose. We'll get this all up and running. So we're in the process of starting the program with Swinburne at the moment, and we have applied this work already to the framework, the systems framework, and so it's all coming together very, very well. So with that, somebody's asked about the lit review. We will put that up. It's not ready just yet, but it will go on our website in the future. And we thank you for participating today. I'm going to do an ESF Impact e-news on this. I wonder whether a couple of people might just send me a sentence, and I'm going to ask somebody like Michelle Young, who's online, Steve Mulligan, Lex, and maybe Suzanne Leckie. If you could just send me a sentence about, your reaction to what you heard today and the fact that the sector is working on this together. If you could do that, by overnight, that would be fantastic, because we'll put out this e-news on Thursday. So thank you.
Could I just add, Susan, if anyone from an agency, wants to have the presentation shared within their own agency, I'm sure that's something that we could do as well. If your team would like to hear more about this research, rather than you just give them the highlights. So welcome, welcome contact from people who might be interested in doing that, and further conversations about the recommendations, etc.
And we can do that through the learning network. I would like to see it in the context of the systems framework, though, so it's all brought together, because there's a lot of other work going on behind the scenes. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. If anybody would prefer to just stay and give me a sentence now, I can type as we talk, and we'll stop recording now, Sarah.